So at long last, the Nova's finally back from paint. It's been 5 months, but it's time to get moving forward. So let's talk about where we go from here. Hi, I'm John, and welcome back to my crazy world. It's been 5 months that the Nova's been gone, but it's finally back, as you can see, with its son of a gun metallic gray paint job on it. It's still not quite finished yet. It still needs about 60 hours of buffing and polishing back at the paint guys, but I needed to get it back so I can get some other stuff done. Unfortunately, one of those things that needs to get done is I actually need to remove the rear axle. When I ordered it, I ordered one for a Chevy Nova, and it showed up and it was a little bit wide. I went ahead and put it in thinking that maybe it was the disc brake conversion that made it a little wider, because those do tend to add about 1 inch of width. And eventually I realized, hey, I had this axle custom made. It should be the standard width. But I went ahead and finished putting it in underneath the car because I was already committed at that point. Wanted to see how well it fit, and it rubs a bit. The tolerances are really tight on where the tires interact with the outer fenders. And so I got a hold of the people that I bought it from, who get it manufactured through Strange Axles. And it turns out that even though I ordered a Nova rear axle, there was a mix-up at the manufacturing plant, and they actually sent me a Camaro rear axle, which is about 1.25 inches wider than a Nova. So I've already talked to them several times. I'm going to be pulling this rear axle out and sending it back to them so they can chop it down to the proper length so it'll fit properly underneath my car. And then hopefully I'm not going to be having any wheel rubbing issues, because in these Novas, if you don't put mini tubs in them, wheel space is at a premium in the rear. So you can see the car has a pretty decent amount of orange peel to it. A lot of that's going to go away, hopefully, as the car goes back to paint and gets about 60 hours of buffing and polishing done. And hopefully at that point it'll look pretty good. Good news is the door alignment looks really good. The fender alignment looks really good. The painter was able to fix a little bit of this gap between the hood and the front fenders. It's not perfect, but it'll be good enough for a driver car. Additionally, over here you can see the 427 cubic inch LS3 engine from Blueprint Engines has arrived. I ordered it about a month after the car left for paint. It was supposed to be gone for 2 to 3 weeks at paint, ended up being 5 months. So even though this engine had a 2-month build time, it actually showed up about 2 months before the car came back. Here is the build sheet on it, the dyno sheet I should say. It tested out at 620 horsepower and 548 pound-feet of torque at the Blueprint Engines factory, and that'll be relevant a little bit later on. So I'm going to spare you guys most of the process of putting this car up on jacks and removing that rear axle, because we already covered putting the rear axle into the car, and it's not super important at this point. What I do want to cover is choosing transmissions and rear axle gear ratios. I've seen that come up in numerous forum posts, numerous questions on Facebook, where people start asking, hey, have this car, it's doing this, I want to do that, what gear ratio should I put in? It seems like people don't really understand what gear ratios do and how to manipulate them to get the result that you want. So that's what we're actually going to talk about in this video. In order to figure out what gearing you want for your car, you need to figure out first what the purpose of your car is going to be. For my Nova, it's going to be a street strip car, which of course means it's going to be 99% street, but I want it to be fun and capable while being enjoyable, and maybe occasionally I'll take it out to one of the local drag strips or to LS Fest, which isn't that far away, and go have some fun with it. But primarily it needs to be drivable on the street and on the highways here in Texas, which have generally 75-mile-an-hour speed limits. I wanted to convert my car from a automatic to a manual. I just enjoy manuals a whole lot more. I've had several of them over the years. I find them to be more engaging, more fun, and just a more immersive driving experience. And since this is a fun car for me, that's what I wanted. So I'm going to be converting it from the 350 turbo transmission that it had when I bought it over to a manual. The question is, which one? So the old 350 turbo had a 420 12 bolt rear differential with positive traction in it. I know that's a mouthful, but it really wasn't very practical on the street, and I'll show you why in the gearing charts later on. And it really needed to be changed, but the question is what to change it to. While I was initially considering the TKX, it was released in the end of 2020 specifically for the aftermarket. It was meant to convert old automatic transmission muscle cars and classic cars or 3 and 4 speed manual cars to a updated 5-speed manual without need for much or any modification to the floor pan. Major reliability concerns started to crop up in a pretty short amount of time though. Some people have had good luck even abusing the cars and running them with more power than their transmissions rated for. But on the other hand, many people have failures within the first 100 miles, or when they do the first fluid change at 500 miles, there's a significant amount of debris and metallic glitter within their fluid, which isn't a great sign for longevity. The TKX could be a great option for people. I think it's awesome that the people over at Tremec decided to come up with the transmission specifically for the aftermarket and release it. It just seems to be having some teething issues. Now, I don't know what the failure rates of them are because obviously a lot more people are going to get onto the internet and say, hey, I'm having a problem, than people getting on the internet and saying, hey, everything's working fine. However, there's enough problems being demonstrated that I don't really want to get caught up in it. And my engine has enough power that I really don't feel comfortable running that much power through the TKX in the current condition that it's in. So eventually I decided to go with the Tremec T56 Magnum transmission instead. Now this gives me a extra gear to use. It's slightly more expensive, however, it gives me more evenly spaced gears. It gives me a higher torque input rating. It gives me a better spread across those ratios. It's a little bit more evenly spread than some of the TKX gear ratios. The resale value on the 6-speed Pro Mod vehicles tends to be a little bit better, it seems like. And it's just a really well established, well thought out transmission with a lot of support in the aftermarket. Whereas the TKX, it's having some teething issues, has some reliability concerns. I don't really particularly care for the way the gearing is laid out on the TKX. We'll get into that a little bit more in a bit. And while the T56 does have some drawbacks, such as the $1,400 initial cost, that's really less than 2% of the build cost for my car and isn't really a factor for me. It's got a little bit more difficult of an install, but a little bit of fabrication never hurt anyone. And it's going to require a little bit of chopping up my transmission tunnel, but it'll be worth it in the end. It does weigh about 36 pounds more than the TKX, but it's only about 15 pounds more than the Turbo 350. I just think that the T56 Magnum pros far outweigh the cons, and they definitely outweigh the pros and cons of the TKX. So once you've narrowed down which transmissions you're interested in, go to the Tremec website and look up their gear ratio calculator. It should look like this page here. Once you're there, you can use the choose transmission box and it'll pre-select some of the pre-filled out Tremec transmissions as well as some of the older ones like the Muncie 4-speed, and that's kind of the easy button. If you're using something else like the 350 Turbo, you may have to manually look up and enter in what the gear ratios are. Also, you'll need to put in the engine RPM, what axle ratio you're using or considering, and then your tire height in inches. Another option is you can take your tire information that you're planning on using or are using and put it into the Tremec aspect ratio calculator that's down at the bottom of the page. Once you've input all of that information, you can go ahead and hit the calculate speed button that's on the kind of right center of the page, and it'll spit out a page full of information. Before we get to the gearing, we kind of need to once again understand what our purpose is. And since I do want to be able to take this car out to the drag strip, potentially on rare occasion, I kind of have a preconceived notion that I want to be able to get through the drag strip, get through the quarter mile using fourth gear and below. So another thing that I did was I took a look at my dyno graph from my engine, which you can see here, and maxes out at 620 horsepower at 6,500 RPM. I can enter that into a quarter mile estimating calculator that you can find several of them online. They're pretty generic. They seem to do mostly the same function, and they're just calculating based off of how much horsepower you have, how much weight you have. If everything works out perfectly, you've got perfect traction, perfect day, sea level, altitude, and air density at a decent temperature, this is the top speed you should be able to get and the time you should be able to get. This calculator from Wallace Racing says that my elapsed time would be about 10.25 seconds with a trap speed of around 132 miles an hour, give or take. The car may end up being 100 or 200 pounds more or less than that. Obviously 620 horsepower isn't going to be what actually gets down to the pavement. I'll lose 10 or 15% of that, give or take, in driveline loss, but it at least gives me a ballpark figure of about 130 miles an hour is what I'd like to be able to see in fourth gear. Once we're done with that, we can go ahead and go to the Tremec gear ratio calculator, enter in all the relevant information, and come up with some results. Just for comparison's sake here, you can see with the 350 turbo transmission and the 4.20 rear differential gear that it had when I initially got the Nova almost 20 years ago now, and the 26-inch tall rear tire, this thing was a total pain to drive around on the highway. You can see that at 3,000 RPM, I was only doing 55 miles an hour. So to do actual freeway speeds, I was turning about 3,400 to 3,600 RPM just to keep up with the flow of traffic. And that car really didn't have a very quiet exhaust. It wasn't super reliable. It spit oil out. It had oil leaks. It had a lap belt that wasn't very well put in. I mean, the car was basically a death trap and a menace and obnoxious on the road. Not particularly safe. Manual steering, manual brakes, it was a disaster, hence why I'm spending a lot of money to go through and make it a decent, modernized, fun car to actually drive around in. But, this gives us a good kind of baseline of where this car initially was. Moving on, we have the Tremec TKX with the 0.68 ratio for fifth gear, using a 3.55 axle ratio. I like to set the engine RPM for 6,000 RPM. I do this because it makes it easy to do the math for 2,000 RPM and 3,000 RPM, which is give or take the low end and the high end of cruising speeds, or as you let the clutch all the way out, you're generally at about 2,000 RPM and maybe kind of cruising along. You accelerate to 3,000 RPM, you put the clutch in, you shift back down to about 2,000 RPM, and you kind of keep the car in a moderate power band when you're just doing normal driving. This obviously isn't for racing, but then you'd be more up at the 6,000 RPM. Bottom line, I do 6,000 RPM because it makes the math a little bit easier for finding out what the speeds are going to be at 2,000, 3,000 RPM for normal, everyday, casual driving, not getting every cop in the world on my case. So anyway, At 6,000 RPM, entered in with an axle ratio of 3.55 and a tire height of 28 inches, and the Tremec TKX's transmission ratios put in on the left side, we can see that the speed achieved by the car looks pretty decent. One thing to look out for here is what I'd call overlap. So as you go from, say, 3,000 RPM in first gear at 25 miles an hour, it goes to 2,000 RPM and 25 miles an hour in second gear, which is fine. That's kind of normal for that first gear to be held kind of long. Then when you go to second gear, you're at 3,000 RPM in second gear, and you'll hit 36 miles an hour in third gear, dropping to 2,000 RPM. So that's fine. They're pretty even there as well. 1 mile an hour drop. And then when you go to third gear, you're at 55 and dropping into 46 miles an hour for 2,000 RPM. So that's what I like to see for an overlap is, the engine RPMs. You don't have to rev it all the way out to 3,000 RPM in third gear to be able to put it into fourth gear and not have it drop way down to like 1,500 RPM and then your engine's lugging along. The problem that I see with the 0.68 fifth gear TKX is you do have to rev it all the way out to 3,000 RPM in fourth gear once again, because it'll drop all the way down to 68 miles per hour at 2,000 RPM in fifth gear, which is something I don't really like, because you go from having a couple gears with decent overlap to having one that has no overlap at the end. And that's just not a whole lot of fun. So we'll move on to the TKX with the 0.81 fifth gear. Now all these speeds, I calculate them by hand. There's a slight variance here, but they're all going to be the same because they're the same gear with the same tire height and the same axle ratio. The only difference is the fifth gear is a different ratio with this transmission compared to the previous TKX. So here you can see in the fourth gear at 3,000 RPM, we'd be doing about 71 miles an hour. But then when we shift into fifth gear at 2,000 RPM is only 57 miles per hour. So once again, we have pretty good overlap. In fact, if you look at third gear at 3,000 RPM, you're at 55 miles an hour. So you could basically skip from third into fifth and go from 3,000 RPM to 2,000 RPM. Now that's pretty nice to have. It's a nice even spacing. The only problem you have with that is at 57 miles an hour in fifth gear, you're once again going to be revving your engine pretty high, kind of the exact same situation that you had with my Turbo 350 and the 420 rear gear is you now are going to be spinning that engine kind of high to be doing something like 70, 75 miles an hour, which is the speed limit pretty commonly here in Texas. So to do 70 miles an hour, you'd once again be spinning somewhere around 26 to 2,700 RPM on your engine, which, considering it's an hour to 3 hours for me to get either down to Houston or over to San Antonio, up to Dallas if I wanted to take the car out there for a car show or a track day, whatever, some sort of event, that's a long time to be keeping this engine revved that high. So not a huge fan of that. The alternative is I could change the axle ratio down to something like a 3.23 or whatever to try and get some of that speed up, but then the car is going to be accelerating a little bit slower in each and every gear. First, second, third, fourth, and fifth. It's going to accelerate a little bit slower in order to try and make up for that high RPM that it would be doing on the highway in fifth gear. So that's why I started leaning a bit more towards the T56, because it already comes with those evenly spaced gears that have a bit more overlap, has a little bit more flexibility, and allows me to do just a little bit more refined driving with that T56. In addition to, it has the ability to tolerate a extra 100 foot-pounds of torque put into it. So when we look at the gear ratio chart here, we can see that there's a 1 mile per hour overlap going from first to second, 4 mile an hour overlap going from second to third, 7 miles an hour going from third to fourth, 12 going from fourth to fifth, and 14 going from fifth to sixth. Being a 3.55 axle ratio, we can see that this car would only be doing 2,000 RPM at 74 miles an hour going down the highway. And in fourth gear, we'd be doing almost 141 miles an hour at 6,000 RPM. And by the time we actually hit the red line at 6,500 RPM, we'd be somewhere around 150 miles an hour. And this is a side effect of having initially chosen 3.55 gear ratio to go with that TKX transmission, and then switching to 256, which has a taller gear ratio for sixth gear. So what I've done here is I've recalculated the T56 transmission with having a 3.90 rear axle ratio. Same 6,000 RPM engine limit, same 28-inch tire height. And we can see now that in fourth gear at 6,000 RPM we'd be at 128 miles an hour, which is pretty close to that 131, 132 mile an hour that the drag racing calculator gave us. But with the engine red line actually being at 6,500 RPM, that's a little bit more than 8% higher than 6,000 RPM. So red line speed would actually be about 8% higher than the 128 miles an hour this is showing. It would actually be closer to about 137 or 138 miles an hour, which is plenty, still gives us a little bit of overhead, and this works out fine. Additionally, at 2,000 RPM, the engine would be doing 67 miles an hour. So to be doing 75 miles an hour, we'd be doing about 2,200 RPM, cruising along, no problem. And with the 3.90 gear ratio, I'll get a little bit better acceleration, about 10% better acceleration in every single forward gear, first, second, third, fourth on the drag strip, as well as fifth and sixth going through the highway. Now the downside to this is, yes, will my fuel economy be a little bit worse? Probably. My bigger concern is that I'm limited to the 275 millimeter wide tires in the back of my Nova since I didn't put any mini tubs in. But we'll see how it goes. I really don't know how traction limited I'm going to be. There's only one way to find out, I guess. So some people have no problem putting down 600 horsepower in a Nova. Kind of depends on what your setup is. But there's not a ton of people out there who have my specific setup that I've seen. So we'll find out in a little bit. But hopefully that helps some of you out with understanding the process of selecting gearing. My rear axle is being picked up in a few days and will be getting switched to a 3.90. This is because it had to go back to the factory anyway. It turns out that when they sent me my axle, they sent me a axle the same width as a 72 Camaro, even though my 72 Nova has the width of a Gen 1 Camaro from 67 to 69. So that's why my rear axle ended up being about an inch and a quarter too wide for my Nova, and why I'm having rubbing issues. But the guys at the shop are taking care of me. They're going to come pick it up freight in a couple of days, and while it's going back to them, I'm going to go ahead and switch out that 3.55 rear axle ratio for a 3.90, and I should be in pretty good shape at that point. So go ahead, like and subscribe if you haven't already, and I'll be back before too long with more Nova progress. Take care.